Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This evening we're going to look at a brief biography of al-Dīn ibn al-Qāwī al-Mardāwī. And if you recognize the name, you'll know this is the author of the Manẓūmat al-Ādāb. This is the poem that we are reviewing together about Islamic morals, manners, and general conduct. He is Shamsuddin. This is the title that he was given, Abu Abdullah. His kunya, Muḥammad, is his first name, Ibn al-Qāwī, Ibn Badran, Ibn Abdullah, al-Maqdisī, al-Mardāwī, al-Ṣāḥibiyyah, al-Dimashqi, al-Hanbali. Okay, so that gives you his kind of full name. Also, it includes, family tree, where he was born, where he ended up, and his school of thought, commonly referred to simply as Ibn al-Qāwī. That's typically what he's called in the scholarship, or he's called al-Nāẓim. Al-Nāẓim being the one who authors poetry or verse. And we'll come to understand exactly why he's known as al-Nāẓim within the madhab. Right? It's just, that's what they say, al-Nāẓim, they're referring to this guy, like the poet. If they say the poet, they're talking about Ibn al-Qāwī. He was born in the village of Marda. It's one of the villages near Nablus in Palestine. This was in the year 630 of the Hijra calendar. That's approximately 1233. Gives you kind of an idea of the time frame. It's political landscape. I think it's important to kind of dive into this a little bit to understand the environment that he grew up in. And there are some lessons that we can walk away from. Understanding how he was raised in the circumstances and then what he was able to accomplish. Ibn al-Qāwī was born, as I said, 630, that's 1233. The Muslim world at the time, particularly Bilad al-Sham and Palestine, were undergoing significant upheaval. The Crusaders' presence was still lingering in parts of Palestine and that coastal region. We know that the Muslim forces had already recovered Jerusalem during the time of Ṣāḥibiyyah al-Ayyubid. We talked about him when we discussed the biography of Ibn Qudamah. Ibn Qudamah being from the forefathers, if you will, of the Hanbalis in that region, having actually fought in Salahuddin's army, was injured in battle. However, and they were victorious. However, the Crusaders, they were not fully expelled from the region. And so there were raids, there was worry. It was rather unstable at times. Also, the Ayyubid dynasty was ruling most of Egypt, Syria, and parts of Hijaz. And after the death of al-Malik al-Kamil, this was in 635. So this is just like 5 years after the birth of Ibn al-Qāwī. The Ayyubid dynasty, the realm in which it occupied became fragmented. And there were various Ayyubid princes that were competing for power. It was kind of typical during that time, those dynasties, how power would transfer. Either it was transferred through inheritance or there was some political maneuvering and sometimes takeovers. Nablus and its surrounding villages like Marda, they were under the Ayyubid sphere of influence. And of course, as I mentioned, affected by some instability. Again, the Crusader raids, the internal power struggles of the dynasty there. And soon, after that, kind of this era in which he was born, there would be the advancing threat of the Mongols from the east. The Mongol invasion, this reached their peak during his lifetime, Ibn al-Qāwī. And this culminated in the catastrophic sack of Baghdad. That was around 656. So Ibn al-Qāwī is born in 630, making him in his 20s. He witnessed, he's not in Baghdad, of course, he's in Bilad Sham. However, after they sacked Baghdad, they advanced further west into Bilad al-Sham. So around 658. And then, of course, they were met by the Muslim armies of Egypt and Syria under the Mamluk leadership. And they ended up in a battle, a very famous battle known as Ain Jalut. And this is where the Muslims, the Mamluks, they were victorious over the Mongols, halted their expansion into Palestine and Syria. And this is kind of like the environment in which Ibn al-Qāwī grew up in this region. We can see that they were still recovering from the Crusader wars. politically fragmented, and dealing with the invasion of the Mongols. It was still a very vibrant culture within the society. Regardless of these instabilities, the Islamic scholarship was thriving. In Al-Quds, Jerusalem, this remained a hub for hadith transmission, the study of fiqh, Arabic studies, and Quranic recitation. Damascus was one of the major centers of learning in the Muslim world, second only to Baghdad, obviously before it was sacked. Right? So when it was sacked, when it was ransacked by the Mongols, a lot of the scholarship was disbanded and much of the authorship was lost. They were just destroying everything, piling bodies, burning buildings, destruction, even all of the books. They threw them in the river in order to create a bridge. They said so many books were thrown in there that the river ran black from all of the ink. So, of course, another central hub for scholarship at the time was in Cairo in Egypt. Scholars during that time, like main pillars and figures, Ibn Salah, al-Nawawi, Ibn al-Arabi of Damascus. These were influential names, and they were shaping the religious atmosphere as well as the legal thought during that period of time. The Hanbali school of law, which is the school of Ibn al-Qāwī, al-Mardāwī. This was also experiencing a revival of sorts in Damascus. We talked about Ibn Qudama and the Maqdisī and how they contributed to the development, or the establishment of a Hanbali presence in the region, as well as the descendants after Ibn Qudama, such as al-Farāģ Ibn Qudama. We're going to talk about him shortly. It's one of his extended relatives, one of the teachers as well. So again, strong emphasis you can find in traditional Sunni Islam, the various different schools of law, the various different schools of doctrine, especially the Hanbali Athari Aqīdah. You can find heavily influencing the way things are developing. And of course, there's also a deep interest in Arabic grammar, in poetry, and rhetoric. And these were fields that Ibn al-Qāwī would excel in. If you think about kind of the social structure of what was happening in his life, he was raised in a village of Marda, generally simple during that time. It was an agricultural area. However, it was connected to scholarly communities and cities. There were families of scholars. And these scholars would host and entertain various students, people making pilgrimages of sorts to seek knowledge with them, journeys in order to become students and transmit knowledge. And then, of course, there was constant trade back and forth between villages and towns. The families that were associated with scholarship, they were considered like the leaders of their communities, like Ibn al-Qāwī. And they had access not only to the scholars of their village, but to traveling scholars. And of course, there was still a very strong oral tradition of passing knowledge down by way of receiving it from a sheikh. They had deep reverence for the scholars, the ulama. We can see that through even the government's patronage of their efforts, opening up schools, funding various different projects. And then you have the businessmen and traders that would also fund the scholars' pursuits. Many of the scholars sometimes held small positions and jobs in order to make ends meet. And if they became recognized and excelled, they would often find patronage from either the ruling class or the businessmen. And of course, we can see that in that time period in the region, there was a high value placed on memorizing the Quran, memorizing hadith, as well as poetry. Mastery of the Arabic language was seen as essential to religious excellence. Poetry and eloquence were still dominant forms of literary and social expression. And this would explain why Ibn al-Qāwī had an inclination toward poetic composition. Why would anyone today write over 1,000 lines of poetry? There's no interest in that today. It's only in very elite academic circles that you would find someone interested in such compositions. But during that time, this was popular. It was of interest, so it fit. His endeavors fit within the spirit of that time period. He received his early education in his hometown, Marda. Al-Mardāwī, you'll find, is the ascription to that village. There are numerous scholars that carry that same nisbah, al-Mardāwī. Ibn al-Qāwī al-Mardāwī is one. There are others, al-Dīn al-Mardāwī. You find that there are many scholars, especially from the Hanbali tradition, they have this ascription to this particular village. And again, that goes to show the tradition that's being passed down from one generation to the next. He had numerous teachers. He studied hadith with, fiqh, language, etc. From among the great teachers that he heard hadith from was Khatib al-Marda. He was the Khatib of the area, Abu Abdullah Muḥammad ibn Ismail al-Maqdisī and Nablus al-Hanbali. And he was not only the Khatib, like the orator and the preacher, but he was also a great scholar in his own right, especially of hadith, and he would narrate hadith to the students. He also sought knowledge not only with a number of scholars in the region, but he also read extensively independently, in addition to attending various different halaqat. He studied fiqh under Shamsuddin ibn Abi Omar and others. Shamsuddin ibn Abi Omar, I alluded to him earlier, al-Farāģ, Shamsuddin, Abdurrahman ibn Abi Omar, Muḥammad ibn Ahmad ibn Muḥammad ibn Qudam al-Maqdisī, al-Jamma'īli al-Salih al-Hanbali, passed away 682. He was a faqih. He was also a very prominent figure within the school. Born in Damascus, he was the first appointed judge for the Hanabila. And he held that position for about 12 years without accepting a salary. He authored several major works. From the most famous of those is a book called al-Shāfī, better known as al-Sharh al-Kabīr, al-Muqni'. Okay, we talked about that when we looked at Ibn Qudama and his al-Mughni. And often you'll find that al-Mughni is printed with al-Sharh al-Kabīr. Okay, so it's a rather profound commentary, very extensive in terms of the subject, of course, Hanbali jurisprudence or fiqh. He was the nephew of Ibn Qudam al-Maqdisī. And he was among the teachers of Imam al-Nawawi in the science of hadith. al-Qāwī also studied grammar. Okay, so first let's just pause right here so we get an idea. We're learning hadith from Khatib Marda. We're learning fiqh. You're a relative of the Maqdisī, right? From that family. So you're learning your fiqh from Shamsuddin ibn Abi Omar. He's known as al-Sharih for al-Sharh al-Kabīr. He got the title al-Sharih. When they said al-Sharih in the books, he's talking about him, right? Like, so profound and so famous, you only need one name. It's not even your first name, it's just a title. Al-Sharih, they're talking about him. So that was his teacher in fiqh. Then Ibn al-Qāwī studied Arabic grammar under Jamāluddīn ibn Malik. You recognize that name? The famous grammarian, Muḥammad ibn Abdullah ibn Malik al-Tā'i al-Jayyani, known as Ibn Malik. He died in 672. He was born in Andalus, migrated to Sham, settling in Damascus. He was a leading authority in grammar, Arabic language, and was deeply knowledgeable in Arabic poetry, Quranic recitations, and hadith narration. It's reported that composing poetry was very easy for him, and for that reason he was able to author the grammatical masterpiece known as Alfiyyah ibn Malik. Well, you recognize it now. Now you know it. Alfiyyah ibn Malik. That was Ibn al-Qāwī's grammar teacher. 1,000 lines, roughly, of poetry in Arabic grammar. Alfiyyah ibn Malik. And that's not the largest poem he wrote about Arabic grammar. Al-Kāfiyah al-Shāfiyyah is like 3,000 lines in Arabic language. Poetry, 3,000 lines of poetry, of verse. So that's Ibn al-Qāwī's pedigree of sorts. That's his background in like these major sciences. And he was an excellent student. He excelled in the Arabic language and grammar. Became highly proficient in jurisprudence, fiqh, hadith. And he engaged deeply in teaching and learning, issuing verdicts, his ifta, issuing the fatwa, authoring scholarly works. Among one of the appointments that he was given was a role as a teacher at Ṣāḥibiyyah School, al-Madrasa al-Ṣāḥibiyyah. And this was a distinguished institution of teaching It was established by Rabi'a Khatun al-Ṣāḥibiyyah. This was the sister of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Opened up a school, and he was appointed as a teacher there. Rabi'a Khatun was first married by her brother to Amir Sa'd ad-Din Anar, and then after his death, Amir Muzaffar ad-Din Kawkaburi, she married him. He was the ruler of Irbil. And he was the one who founded Jami' al-Hanabila. That's the Hanbali mosque in the Ṣāḥibiyyah district of Damascus. Everything's popping off during this time. All of these major developments are happening. These places have become landmarks, very famous. A Ṣāḥibiyyah School was located on the eastern slope of Mount Qasiyun. This is close to the Hanbali Masjid, facing it from the east. A renowned scholar, Ibn Badran, he noted that he noted this school's presence in one of his books, and he said it's among the monuments that testify to the advancement of architectural art in that era. So it was obviously well built and constructed. It was rather unique, probably very lavish for that time. And that goes to show you that appreciation that generation had for scholarship and knowledge, that they were willing to spend and to support not only building infrastructure, but also becoming patrons of the teachers and scholars that would lead the way within those institutions. So it's noted that the significance of the school, its legacy, if you will, that centuries later its nameplate was carefully restored and inscribed in exquisite handwriting from one of the master calligraphers, Mamduh al-Sharif. Preservation reflects the lasting place of this school, Ṣāḥibiyyah, in the cultural and religious heritage of Damascus, and of course, the circle of its scholars. In al-Qāwī, his appointment to teach in this institution stands as a testament to his scholarship, his distinction. He had a trusted position among the learned circles of his time, particularly within the flourishing Hanbali tradition of Damascus. He also attended frequently the lessons of Darul Hadith, another one of their multiple schools. It wasn't just Ṣāḥibiyyah, there were multiple institutions around the region. And he also was active in the scholarly gatherings, the halaqat, at the Mount Qasiyun in Damascus. Among those who studied under him was Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. He learned Arabic grammar from him, of course. Student of the great Ibn Malik. It would be an honor. That would be like the prize university to go to today. It'd be equivalent to that. You're going to Harvard, you're going to Yale, or one of those, Columbia, or whatever it may be, right? He was noted as very praised by many of the scholars of the past, of course, al-Hafiz, al-Dīn, al-Barzali. He said that he was a virtuous sheikh, very well-versed in fiqh, grammar, language, possessing a vast or a very strong memory. He issued fatwa. He served as a teacher at Ṣāḥibiyyah School for a time. Studied under numerous shuyukh, and he composed a number of poems. Al-Hafiz Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi. It's also noted that Imam al-Dhahabi was one of his students. He said he was righteous in religious observance, very religious practice. It says Hasan ad-Diyana, had good religious practice. He wasn't just somebody that preached and teach, but also lived the life. He had a good character. He was very beneficial. He served as a teacher at Ṣāḥibiyyah School for a period. He used to frequent Darul Hadith. He was actively involved there at Mount Qasiyun. He had many anecdotes and witty stories, and he was among the most admirable of the shuyukh. Al-Dhahabi also described him as the learned, the jurist, the grammarian, the remnant of the righteous predecessors. It's often a kind of a title or a description that they give someone that's very unique in their time, almost resembling the past, baqiyat as-salaf, almost like they're not from this generation. They're not of these people. They remind us of the days gone by. And he studied under the shuyukh and then excelled in both the madhab and the Arabic language. Al-Dhahabi said, I sat with him, listened to his speech, and received an ijazah, permission to narrate from him. Safarini, one of the latter era scholars, he said he's the peerless imam, meaning unmatched, unique. He's an example, the most astute luminary. He's the Sibawayh of his era. He put the finest pearls of speech to shame with his poetry and outshone the brilliance of dawn with his eloquence, the ocean with the abundance of his knowledge, and the rain clouds with the outpouring of his pen. The exemplary leader, Imam Shamsuddin, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn al-Qāwī al-Mardāwī, the jurist, the hadith expert, the grammarian, the Hanbali, the Athari. And of course, like the great teachers, he had many notable students. From those students, al-Qāḍī Shamsuddin Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Muslim al-Sāliḥī became a distinguished jurist and grammarian in Damascus. He was orphaned at a young age. He devoted himself to religious sciences. He excelled in Arabic and fiqh. Later served as a judge, noted for his integrity and firm commitment to justice. He passed away in Medina during his 4th pilgrimage. And that's saying something during that time. We're not taking airplanes. We're taking caravans, okay? Another one of his students, Taqiyuddin Ahmad ibn Abd al-Halim ibn al-Salam ibn Abdullah ibn Abi al-Qasim ibn Taymiyyah al-Harrani al-Dimashqi al-Hanbali. We know him as Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam. Of course, this is one of his students, as I mentioned, born in Harran, 661. He migrated with his family to Damascus following the Mongol invasions. He pursued advanced studies across the Islamic sciences. He studied Arabic grammar under Ibn al-Qāwī. It's an obvious influence that contributed to his later mastery of language, rhetoric, and precise argumentation. Of course, we know Ibn Taymiyyah rose to become one of the foremost scholars of his time, excelling in fiqh, theology, hadith, the Quran, tafsir. Passed away in 728. His works were profound and lasting impact on Islamic thought and continue to shape scholarly discourse until this very day. So Ibn al-Qāwī was of the foundations of that legacy. That's one of the things that the teachers always look to have is a student that will have an impact, because they recognize man sanna fil islami sunnatan hasana aw addal al khair kafa'ili. Whoever introduces something good in Islam, they'll have the reward, even the one that does it without detracting from the reward of those that do it after them. Or whoever points someone towards good will have the reward of doing it themselves. Right? These are hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So a teacher's dream is that the concept is they're investing into their students in hopes that their students will go on and excel and will have an impact, and they will receive some type of sadaqah jariyah, okay, some type of continuous good deeds. Ibn al-Qāwī, he authored numerous books, of course. Not only was he a teacher, he was also an author, prolific, in fact. Many of his works were composed of verse, Manẓūmat, writing poetry, like his Shaykh Ibn Mālik. ʿIqd al-Farāʿid wa kanz al-Fawā'id. This is Ibn al-Qāwī's monumental work. It's a vast poem, Manẓūma, composed at the Dāliya rhyme. I mentioned this to you earlier when we started looking at his Dāliya in al-Ādāb. It's one of the largest poetic compositions in Islamic legal literature. Ibn Badran remarked in his al-Madkhal, Madkhal is kind of like an introduction to the Hanbali madhab. He says that the poem reaches approximately 5,000 lines, although other sources estimate it to be closer to 15,000 lines of poetry, regardless of the exact number, between 5,000 and, for us, it's like once you get past a couple hundred, you're like, oh, what? I mean, like, you can take me into the ocean. I'm only going to go about 10 feet deep, and I'm not going any deeper than that. I can go down into the abyss. Yeah. So Ibn al-Qāwī is going into the abyss, and we just want to dip our toe in there and just kind of swim around and splash a little bit. We're not actually diving. Right? Yeah. Things are unexplored down there. We don't know. It can be scary, especially trying to take on a project like that, 5,000 lines or more. Anyway, the work is undeniably massive, okay? And it's well known. As I mentioned before, Ibn al-Qāwī was known as al-Nāẓim, the versifier, the one who writes in poetry. And this ʿIqd al-Farāʿid is known simply as al-Manẓūma. or al-Naẓm. When you're looking in the legal works of the Hanabila, whenever they refer to al-Manżūma, they're talking about this. If they're talking about al-Naẓm, this is what they're talking about. They would have to add something. Manżūmat fulan, if they wanted to mean some other manzuma, the manzuma of so-and-so. They would have to add a qualifier, because otherwise it's assumed when you say manzuma, you're talking about this guy's poem. Or if they said al-Nāẓim, it means him, Ibn al-Qāwī. This is how he was recognized among the Hanbali scholars that came after. And the work here, ʿIqd al-Farāʿid, is a versification or a poetic rendition of al-Muqni' by Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisī. He also incorporated a material from his own teacher, Abdurrahman ibn Abi ʿUmar, from al-Sharh al-Kabir. He added content from al-Kāfī, elaborating on al-Muqni', and he had selected additions from al-Muharrar. So it was a legal composition. And he embedded within it his own versified treatise on Islamic inheritance law, al-Farāʿid, Rawdat al-Rā'ib fi ilm al-Farāʿid. So this is about inheritance law, so he obviously authored lines of poetry covering this particular area of legal code. And through these incorporations of these major works in Islamic law, he essentially, as the scholars have noted, versified the core Hanbali fiqh as it stood at the time. And he created a comprehensive poetic summary of the school's legal tradition. So it was everything that was available. What stood as the representation of Hanbali legal code, he put it in a poem. Okay? And when he authored that, he prioritized the correct and strongest legal positions within the madhab. What it would be known as ar-rājih. Like within the madhab, you're going to have some variant views, and then the scholars, they will exercise their judgment to determine which of those is the preferred or strongest in order to arrive at a conclusion that this is the official view of the school. And so that's what he prioritized when he authored the poem, and he did the best based on what was available to him at the time. And this poem remains a testament to his level of scholarship, his poetic mastery, his commitment to preserving and disseminating the legal code of the Hanabila. And then after he wrote this poem, he followed it with the Manẓūmat al-Ādāb, which was the poetry that we're looking at together in Islamic conduct. This is also a very famous work, independently from al-Manżūma, right? It has its own level of recognition. Manẓūmat al-Ādāb, it's often referred to as, roughly 1,000 lines as well of poetry on conduct and manners. Al-Ādāb al-Shar'iyyah sometimes, or al-Ādāb. Sometimes it's referred to as as-Sughra, the minor poem, in reference to the Manżūma of 5,000 or more lines. This one at 1,000 is considered the minor poem. Okay? As I mentioned to you before, Manẓūmat al-Ādāb, about 1,000 lines. Some have said that there's a Manżūma Kubra, and some said Manżūma Sughra for Ādāb. Right? There's a larger one, then he authored a shorter one. The one that we're looking at now is like over 100 and some lines, and this was the one that was explained by Imam al-Hajjawi. But again, that's debated among the scholars as to did he write one or two. If he only wrote one, the 1,000 line, then it meant that the scholars that went behind to explain, they picked lines from the poem in order to explain, and it did not, it wasn't exhaustive in nature. Regardless, the cases I mentioned, the scholars have constantly referred to his works, especially this, as we're looking at, Musa al-Hajjawi in his Fath al-Wahhab, Sharh al-Ādāb, also as-Safarini's Ghidhā' al-Albāb fi Sharh Manẓūmat al-Ādāb. These were works that were authored specifically to explain some of the lines of that poem. He also authored another book called Majma' al-Bahrain. This is an unfinished explanation of al-Muqni' by Ibn Qudama. It was, regardless of it being unfinished, is a major contribution to Hanbali legal literature. It's often referred to as a reference work. He also authored Naẓm al-Furūq. This is a poetic versification. Again, it's another Naẓm here, another poem of an important earlier Hanbali work on legal furuq, or distinctions. And the source of this is al-Furūq by Muḥammad ibn Abdullah ibn Hussein al-Samiri, also known as Ibn Sunayna. He was a Hanbali jurist and senior judge, a Qāḍī. So the Furūq here often involve nuanced cases within legal code where there are two rulings that appear to be similar, yet legally they're different. So these are al-Furūq al-Fiqhiyya, right? So they're these legal differences. And so they take a look at these things, and you can see they're obviously discussing what the distinguishing factors and qualities of these rulings are. And so this was his versification of that particular work. He also authored Tabaqat al-Ashab. It's a biographical work outlining the ranks and contributions of the Hanabila. And we've seen that many of the great scholars, this was part of their tradition, was learning about the scholars of their school and often authoring works to highlight that history and those biographies, and sometimes to fill in the gaps in the errors between times. Imam al-Ulaymi has one, al-Manhaj al-Ahmad, who's the work we're looking, Fath al-Rahman fi Tafsir al-Quran, we're studying that. Imam al-Ulaymi, Mujiruddin al-Ulaymi, had also authored a book in Tabaqat al-Hanabila, and you can find he has an entry for Ibn al-Qāwī for sure. He also wrote Kitab al-Ni'mah. He wrote al-Muntaqa fi Sharh al-Umdah. This was Umdat ibn Mālik. It was an explanation of Arabic grammar. So that gives you an idea of some of his great works, some of his students, some of his mashayikh, some of the context in which he grew up. You should note that with all of the instability, if you were to say such a thing during that time, the political landscape constantly changing, the invasion of the Mongols, the Crusaders' presence still there, causing a bit of instability, uncertainty, Ibn al-Qāwī continued to pursue the life of a scholar. He was not paralyzed by the circumstances in which he lived. And he was a master of the sciences across the board. He wasn't fixated on one particular thing, like whatever political thing was happening at the time, to where we have to ignore everything else and just focus on this one thing. Right? But he continued, as all of the scholars during that time they did. They continued to preach and to teach, and there's no doubt they were going to be addressing the situation of what's happening in scholarly fashion, but it did not come at the expense of the rest of the deen. Right? So sometimes you might hear people nitpick at that. They'll say, well, why are you talking about these issues when we have another issue going on? There's some instability in the Muslim world, or there's some war happening, or there's some famine happening, or there's some disease, or there's something happening. Why are you talking about prayer? Fiqh, salah. Why are you talking about how to make wudu? Why are you talking about business and trade transactions? When this is happening, it's almost to say as if this other stuff is worthless in light of what's happening. Of course, there's certain priorities that we're going to have, but the reality of it is, a lot of times these things, they're localized. There's limited access or impact of what someone could do besides watch the news today and get online and spill your emotions, right? So we have to maintain some level of balance with setting lofty aims and objectives in what we can achieve, okay? Because this is a great scholar who obviously had lofty aims and objectives to be able to accomplish what he did and produce not only the students that he did, but also the works that continue to leave a lasting impact on us until this very day. He passed away the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, 699, Hijra calendar, that's in December of 1299. He was buried at the foothills of Mount Qasiyun in Damascus among the Hanabila there. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to shower him with mercy and to elevate his rank. Allahumma ameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad.